I'm Kenvan Roth, the director of the Land Use Institute here, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all to the 9th annual Norman Williams Distinguished Lecture in Land Use Planning and Law, one of the longer titles for such an event. Norman Williams was a key figure in the history of land use planning, both as a legal discipline and as it played out in the realms in which he lived. Also a key figure in the history of Vermont Law School and environmental law in Vermont. In fact, his achievements in the world of land use planning of his time, which was not that long ago, still resonate in some very current issues. Norman came here in 1975 after a distinguished career as a land use planner and lawyer in New York City and New Jersey. Starting as a zoning analyst in the city soon after graduating from Yale Law School in 1943, he was director and then chief of planning there, that is in New York, from 1950 to 1960. He subsequently played a lead role in New Jersey's pioneering Mount Laurel decision that in 1975 struck down exclusionary zoning, a decision leading to 1985 fair housing legislation in that state that is currently, like in the last 2 months, being challenged on the one hand by all sides on the issue, and on the other hand by the governor in a couple of appeals that have been recently argued in the New Jersey Supreme Court. Williams had worked as a scholar and teacher at Rutgers and Yale. His multi-volume treatise, American Land Planning Law, published originally in 1974, is a standard work, now in its 3rd edition, and still currently being supplemented. At Vermont Law School, Williams played a key role in the founding of the Environmental Law Center and in the development of the now defunct planning phase of Vermont's Act 250, which interestingly is currently the planning phase, that is, being resurrected in a bill pending in the current legislature. Norman was active at VLS as a teacher until his retirement in 1995, and he surrounded himself with the brightest and best of our students in his years here. Today and tonight, we carry on his vision through our teaching in land use and related topics, and the projects of the Land Use Institute and students in other activities, as well as through this lecture, established through the generosity of our trustee, Francis Yates, in memory of Charles and Anya Yates, Anya having been one of Williams' leading students. The lecture has brought to VLS a succession of leading figures in the realm of land use, broadly understood, among whom tonight's speaker is one of the most luminous, and who will now be introduced by John Echevarria, the director of the Environmental Law Center.
I just want to start by saying I do not appreciate all the comments I've gotten about how nice I look in a suit, as if I'd never appeared in one before. I don't know what Mr. Liberty might think. It is my great pleasure to have the opportunity to introduce my friend, Robert Liberty. There is simply no one better qualified to step into Norman Williams' shoes to talk about the land use challenges we face today. Now, to understand Robert, you have to understand where he came from. He was born and raised in Oregon, a beautiful place some people call the other Vermont. He graduated from the University of Oregon, and except for a few brief excursions, including one to attend Harvard Law School and another to spend a few years at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, he spent most of his adult life living and working in Oregon, or at least living and working from Oregon. To understand Robert, you also have to understand the time in which he grew up. When Robert was in college, when he was young and impressionable, Governor Tom McCall, a Republican, issued his famous clarion call for sound land use planning and regulation. He said in part in his 1973 gubernatorial address to the legislature, "There is a shameless threat to our environment and to the whole quality of life, unfettered despoiling of the land, sagebrush subdivisions, coastal condomania. We are dismayed that we have not stopped misuse of the land, our most valuable finite natural resource. We are in dire need of a state land use policy, new subdivision laws, new standards for planning and zoning by cities and counties. The interests of Oregon for today and in the future must be protected from the grasping wastrels of the land." The grasping wastrels of the land. "We must respect another truism, that unlimited and unregulated growth leads inexorably to a lowered quality of life. By the end of this month," he said, "I will submit messages covering this topic to the legislature." The upshot of this call to action was the enactment of Oregon's landmark statewide land use planning and regulatory laws, the envy of people across the country who think and care about the land, including here in Vermont. In my mind's eye, Robert was glued to a radio, listening to and being inspired by Governor McCall's words. In any event, after picking up his necessary credentials, he returned to Oregon and spent most of the last 30 years defending, strengthening, justifying, and explaining the Oregon land use system in Oregon, and more recently in such far places as Beijing, China, and Auckland, New Zealand. After graduating from law school, he obtained a position as a staff attorney with 1,000 Friends of Oregon, the nonprofit watchdog group overseeing the implementation of the Oregon land use system. And by the way, the model for many other 1,000 friends groups around the country. After a stint in private law practice, he became the executive director of 1,000 Friends of Oregon and held that position for 8 years. As head of 1,000 Friends of Oregon, Robert led that organization to new heights, fending off numerous political challenges to the state land use program. In addition, in his spare time, he helped launch and lead the National Smart Growth Movement. After his long tenure at 1,000 Friends, nearly 20 years, Robert became senior counsel to Congressman Earl Blumenauer, the famously bow-tied congressional maverick who heads both the Congressional Bicycle Caucus and the Congressional Livable Communities Task Force. In 2005, grasping for the nettle of political power himself, Robert ran for and was elected to a seat on the Metro Council, the only popularly elected metropolitan-level governing body in the United States, where he had the opportunity to put into action his thinking on transportation policy, housing affordability, and other issues affecting the Portland metropolitan area. Finally, still young and vibrant after all of this work, Robert has joined the ranks of the Academy at Portland State University, where he is the director of the newly created Urban Sustainability Accelerator with the mission of assisting small and mid-sized urban areas across the United States to implement high-priority sustainability projects. This listing of appointments and accomplishments provides you some evidence, but does not truly reveal the full extent of Robert's influence as a sober, effective voice for progressive policies in Oregon, in the United States, and around the world on land use management at the urbanizing fringe, private property rights, transit-oriented development and other transportation policies, and rural land use preservation. Plus, and not least of all, Robert has a wonderful sense of humor, which in these difficult times, and the very difficult times to come, is a quality very much to be admired. So with that, Robert.
You do me a great honor by inviting me to join the distinguished roster of speakers participating in this lecture series, but it's a greater honor to address you, because people in this audience have done so much for Vermont, people who are in public service, active citizens, faculty members, and law students. You've done a lot for your state and thereby provided an example for the nation, and that's an even greater honor. Those honors were probably enough to get me to accept this invitation, but they were extended, the invitation was extended to me by John, and John is a national leader in a sensible interpretation of the Takings Clause the Fifth Amendment of our Constitution. And that work really is a national service. John came to our aid in Oregon when so-called property rights initiative threatened to destroy 40 years of work to stop sprawl, build livable cities, and to conserve our farm, forest, and rangelands. John is one of many Vermonters, past and present, who have made contribution to Oregon's planning efforts and to Oregon's politics. In fact, my campaign manager in 2004 was a young man named Matt Reed, who grew up in Burlington and who worked on Peter Shumlin's first campaign for governor. Matt's is an example of an affinity between our two states, affinity based on our deep concern for the use of land and respect for the environment. People from other states think people from Oregon and Vermont wear Birkenstocks to the office, assuming we work at all, that we lighten our lattes with milk from cows we know on a first-name basis, and bait our barbless trout hooks with organic tofu. For those who ridicule our state's values and efforts will find their laughter fading away in the not-too-distant future, because I think the environmental problems we face on this planet are no joke. My concern is not based only on what I've read, but a series of experiences I've had over the last decade. On a warm summer day in 2003, two friends and I were trudging up a couloir on Glacier Peak Wilderness in Washington State, leading to Spider Pass. It's a trip I had done 17 years earlier. As we got close, I breathlessly told them about a special sight that awaited them. From the summit of the pass, you'd look down and you'd see a glacier spilling off Chihuahua Mountain. And it was such a protected area that it formed a little tabular glacier, like a big disc of white snow coming out into the valley. I got to the top, I threw my pack off, I walked down the trail, and glacier was gone. All that was left were snowfields, a little remnant of the glacier up at the summit. A few years later, I was traveling down the length of British Columbia in a jet, and I looked out the window. Below me was a forest that was the color of dried tobacco. And we flew over that forest for 20 or 30 minutes, a dead forest, part of millions of acres of land killed by the spruce budworm stretching from Oregon to the shores of Ketchikan Bay in Alaska. Spruce budworm population has exploded because our winters are too warm. In recent years, as John mentioned, I've traveled to China to exchange ideas about how to make its massive urbanization more sustainable. For those of you who have been there, you know that the scope and scale of urbanization is unprecedented in human history. What you're looking at here is 25,000 housing units under construction as part of one project in one new city. And by the way, it was completed in 18 months. In 2011 in Beijing, I was briefed about one of the many new cities being built in China, a new eco-city for 800,000 people called Zhaofeidian on the Bohai Sea. The project director told us their goals, which were very impressive. 80 to 90% of the trips would be made by walking, biking, or transit. A 1,000-acre estuarine wetland park would clean all the stormwater from the city. And he said, not 1 hectare of farmland was used to build the city. When we toured the site, a couple days later, this was the entrance road, a billboard showing the road we were on, 10 lanes wide. As we traveled toward the city, I realized that we were traveling over an area of fill of the sea that was between 20 and 100 square miles. Offshore from the new city was an island that had been created that would be the location for a coal terminal, oil refinery, and steel smelter. I learned that spaces were reserved in the parks for pumping oil and natural gas. Eco-city indeed. A month later, I was visiting at my sister and brother-in-law's new home in Edmonds, Washington, looking out over Puget Sound. And in front of me rumbled a train, 100 cars long, filled with coal going to Bellingham to be shipped to China. That coal is used to help produce our smartphones, our furniture, and our Christmas decorations. And then this April, terrible news came from Netarts Bay. in Oregon, the location of the Whiskey Creek Oyster Hatchery. I opened the paper on April 11th to read this story. Shortly after the turn of the century, the oysters stopped reproducing. Marine biologists from Oregon State University came to Whiskey Creek Hatchery to find out what was wrong, and they looked for parasites, and they couldn't find any. And finally, Alan Barton, a researcher at the hatchery, said, "Why don't you check the pH in the seawater?" Ocean had become so acidic that the oyster sprats could not reproduce. Ocean acidification comes from the deposition of carbon dioxide into seawater, and as such, it's often grouped with climate change. It's not climate change. It has a very different impact. Consider the vast number of species of mollusks and fish that have carbonate-based bones and shells, tests, exoskeletons. But the thing that is really disturbing is phytoplankton. Phytoplankton also have calcareous structures. Phytoplankton produce about 30 to 60% of our oxygen. Alan Barton, the researcher at the Whiskey Creek Oyster Hatchery, said to the paper, quote, "I didn't believe any of this stuff 3 years ago. I was always skeptical about our global models, but ocean acidification is pretty cut and dried for me now. You see it every day. I'm afraid the ocean will be dead long before we have to worry about the implications of global warming." A growing list of writers, social scientists, historians, economists, and policy advocates like Jared Diamond, Richard Wright, Paul Gilding, Lester Brown, E.O. Wilson, Martin Rees, Dennis Meadows, and Vermont Law School's own Gus Speth believe that our civilization is in peril. Some of them believe it may not survive this century. Dennis Meadows is a professor emeritus of systems policy at the University of New Hampshire. More than 40 years ago, he and his wife and some other researchers put together a model called World 3. It was to model the interaction between the human population and the resources and systems that support the human population. The results were published in a famous book in 1972 called The Limits to Growth. According to an online article published in Scientific American in May of this year, quote, Meadows contends that the model's sustainable pathways are no longer within reach. Collapse will not be driven by a single identifiable cause, simultaneously acting on all countries, he observes. It will come through a self-reinforcing complex of issues, including climate change, resource constraints, and socio-economic inequality. We're in for a period of sustained chaos whose magnitude we are unable to foresee, Meadows warns. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." I always understood that poem, Ozymandias by Shelley, as a meditation on the hubris of kings, or maybe on humankind, whose pride is inevitably humbled by time. But now the poem has a very different meaning for me. Archaeologists believe that the ancient city empires in the Tigris-Euphrates, like Ur, collapsed in large part because of salinization caused by unsustainable agriculture. The ruins of those cities are now surrounded by deserts that their own farm practices created, deserts stretching to the horizon. I thought of that poem when a dust storm blowing out of the desert, advancing upon the desert that's advancing upon Beijing, turned the sunset skies over Oregon a deep red 2 years ago. Well, that's pretty grim, isn't it? It's my hope that 20 years from now I'll meet you at some party somewhere and you'll remind me of the doomsday tone of the speech, and I will chuckle and laugh and blush deeply in embarrassment because it turned out not to be true. That's what I hope. That's not what I believe. But just in case, I've hedged my bets. Almost everything I will propose doing this evening has practical benefits that will justify its adoption no matter what happens in coming decades. So, what is to be done? Obviously, many things by many people, from economic restructuring to social and technological change. But I'll address only the subjects I know best. Those are land use planning, regulation, and transportation planning. Much of what I propose is based on my long work on the implementation, enforcement, defense, and improvement of the Oregon Planning Program, which will celebrate its 40th anniversary in May this year. But my perspective also reflects the 18 months of research I carried out for Smart Growth America, looking at sprawl curtailment policies in all 50 states and all regions that had something interesting to offer. These 3 reports are 800 pages. There's a big section on Vermont. We're approaching the centenary of the publication of the Model Zoning Enabling Act and the Model Planning Act. When they were drafted, America's industrialization and urbanization was at its peak. We were experiencing what China's experiencing now, although on a smaller scale. That industrialization and urbanization was supported by new technology, fueled by population growth and by the rapid exploitation of America's abundant land, water, minerals, and other resources. Now we need a new model act for the 21st century, and we have to confront very different challenges. The challenges of limitation, of depletion, of destruction and contamination of the resources and natural systems that support our civilization. I'll describe some of the reforms that should be part of the new Model Act, grouped under a few headings: reforming urban growth patterns, curbing rural sprawl, transportation planning, monitoring, and enforcement. The essence of most residential zoning from the time of its inception almost a century ago is the use of the power of the state, the police power, to separate housing by its type and cost, and thereby to segregate the residents by their income and by extension their race, ethnicity, and national origin. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is very clear in the history of residential zoning. The Federal District Court in the seminal case of Euclid v. Ambler, which was the constitutional test of zoning, understood this aspect of zoning very clearly when he discussed the Supreme Court's invalidation of Kentucky's racial zoning statute in Buchanan v. Worley, something struck down many years before by the U.S. Supreme Court. And no gift of second sight is required to foresee that if this Kentucky statute had been sustained, its provisions would have spread from city to city throughout the length and breadth of the land. And it's equally apparent that the next step in the exercise of this police power would be to apply similar restrictions for the purpose of segregating in like manner various groups of newly arrived immigrants. The blighting of property values and the congesting of population whenever the colored races or certain foreign races invade a residential section are so well known as to be within judicial cognizance. The purpose to be accomplished by the Euclid zoning ordinance is really to regulate the mode of living of persons who may hereafter inhabit it. In the last analysis, the result to be accomplished is to classify the population and segregate them according to their income or situation in life. So even though he accepted the proposition that when colored races and foreigners invaded a residential district, depressed property values, he said, no, this is not a proper use of the police power, and he struck Euclid zoning ordinance down. But the same defect that the district court judge found in Euclid's ordinance and invalidated as unconstitutional, the Supreme Court accepted as a legitimate public purpose. Quote from the Supreme Court decision, with particular reference to apartment houses, and we know who lives in apartment houses. Now I can say this because I lived in them for 30 years. But obviously people in apartment houses are undesirable. It is pointed out that the development of detached house sections is greatly retarded by the coming of apartment houses, which has sometimes resulted in destroying the entire section for private house purposes. That in such sections, very often the apartment house is a mere parasite, constructed in order to take advantage of the open space and attractive surroundings created by the residential character of the district. Moreover, the coming of one apartment house is followed by others. So there's a direct analogy made to disease and contamination. The result is residential zoning, of this kind of residential zoning, is a landscape of class separation visible from the air in suburban areas around nearly every city in America. Over here is the manufactured home park, next to the highway and trucking warehouses. Over there are the apartment buildings. Off in a pod by itself are some townhomes. Over here is the tidy subdivision with small lots, and over there are the homes built on 2-acre lots next to the golf course. And all of that is controlled by zoning. Judicial supervision of zoning, exclusionary zoning, is undertaken by the New Jersey court after the Laurel decision was a noble effort. But it will never be effective in remedying exclusionary zoning. As that sequence of cases shows, the court system is not designed to supervise government zoning and zone administration, nor can we expect any help from the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is made up of people who have no experience in the real world of planning, of urban design, and urban development, and have them for some time. I don't know, I'm not quite sure how to interpret that applause, but the remedy lies in planning and zoning reform to end exclusionary zoning. Many states and cities have done this, or at least some aspects of it. In my home state, the state law mandates that every city have an adequate supply of land zone for apartments. Manufactured homes must be allowed on any vacant lot in any residential zone. And as a hearings officer, I did that. I administered that law. Minimum lot sizes must be reduced. Local government home rule powers cannot be used to block affordable housing projects. Clear and objective standards must be applied to the review of housing to prevent exclusionary zoning from creeping in under the guise of aesthetic standards. In the Portland region, accessory dwelling units are allowed on every single residential lot in every zone. And in the city of Portland, duplexes are allowed on all corner lots. Well, what has happened? Skip through this. What has happened is that the average size of new single-family lots in the Portland region fell from 12,000 square feet in 1978 to about 6,000 square feet in 1982, and now it's about 4,400 square feet. The amount of land zoned for apartments tripled. Those apartments were built, and people of modest means now have access to the jobs in the suburbs. And the equity results have been very impressive. This is the actual front page of the Oregonian from about a decade ago. And the story describes how the region grew more economically and racially integrated in the 1990s as other regions moved backwards. It's not because we spent money on affordable housing, it's because we busted exclusionary zoning. Breaking exclusionary zoning means that families of modest means can have the choice of places to live. The choice to live in a school district with a good school, to live near a job. It means access to shopping. More economic and social integration in our neighborhoods will help, if only in a small way, deal with the challenge that Mr. Meadows sees and others see, which is that our division into classes threatens our social stability. Ending exclusionary zoning reduces sprawl significantly, saving land, natural resources, and investments in infrastructure. By allowing the market, remember this is market-oriented, to build more densely, we develop patterns of urbanization that work better with transit, active transportation, and a mixture of uses. What is essential for fairness and justice and opportunity is also integral to the conservation of our land and our resources. Reforming exclusionary zoning should be part of a larger and more fundamental rethink of urban development. For 40 or 50 years, we've assumed that we grow through greenfield development, that that's simply the way growth occurs. That's our default assumption. We need to change that assumption. We don't need to do that, and we no longer can afford to do that. And we can start with our existing built environment. In 1950, the average household size was 3.0 people, and the average new single-family home size was 983 square feet. By 2006, the average new single-family home size was 2,408 square feet, and the average household size by 2010 had fallen to 2.58 people. In other words, in 60 years, we tripled the amount of space available in our homes for each of us. And today, about 60% of households consist of one person or two persons. Only about a quarter of the households consist of 2 adults and a child. We're still building for Ozzie and Harriet. And, Ozzie's dead, Harriet's in a retirement home, the kids have all split up. Our new model code, and their kids are out of work. Our new model code and our building code should provide for the evolution of those big suburban McMansions into duplexes and triplexes and group homes for the young, the old, and the lonely. The space over the garage can become a new flat. We have to encourage the development and siting of prefabricated homes and home components. To To the extent we need to build new housing stock, we can find it through infill and redevelopment, not greenfield sprawl. We have decades worth of land available along the thousands of miles of strip commercial sprawl across America. And although we have a long way to go, at least in our region, we are approaching probably the 50% mark for infill and redevelopment as a source of the location for housing. The reality is that a combination of rapidly falling infrastructure funding combined with shifting consumer preferences and income stagnation means that infill and redevelopment and adaptive reuse is already accelerating. In fact, near my house, there was a project done by D.R. Horton, one of the largest builders of suburban homes in the United States. And what they did, think about this, D.R. Horton. They took 3 single-family lots, 5,000 square feet, and they built 29 homes on them. The largest was 684 square feet, the smallest 364 square feet. They're all sold. Now, if D.R. Horton is thinking about it, the time has come to rethink how we use land in our cities. We can take advantage of these trends to welcome and facilitate that evolution through the new model code. Now to another subject. It is past time to stop treating urban growth boundaries as an exotic outlier, too radical for general adoption, which is how it is generally regarded in planning circles in the United States. This is an interesting combination. Denounce the Supreme Court, 1 clap, support urban growth boundaries, 3. I'm going to work up to higher tones. Urban growth boundaries are not confined to Oregon. You can find them in South Dakota. This is Sioux Falls. You can find them in Charleston, South Carolina, not seen as a beacon of planning progressivity. You can find them now in the Denver Regional Council of Governments. And the oldest one is not in Oregon, it's in Kentucky, in Lexington. And of course, we use them in Oregon, we have them around all of our cities. By my count, 12 million Americans live inside urban growth boundaries, more people than live in Ohio. New model code should include urban growth boundaries as a key element of a multifaceted approach to curbing urban sprawl and leapfrog development that has these components. A boundary to mark the limits to urban development, adopted and implemented through binding comprehensive plans and consistent land use regulation and maps that are unambiguous. The boundary is also used to limit the extension of urban services, facilities, highways, sewers, water lines. For the boundary to work, you have to have effective measures to prevent urban and exurban development outside of it. And I'll talk about that in a moment. Inside the boundary, changes to land use regulations to allow higher density with the kinds I've been discussing to promote infill and redevelopment. And then you need a government body with the authority to take and compel action and the funds to pay for the work and defray the costs of compliance by local governments. But these places that have urban growth boundaries have something that lies outside the scope of planning and land use regulation, and it's something that Vermont is particularly rich in. A strong civic infrastructure of nonprofit groups and civic institutions that monitor, enforce, and defend a program during the frequent periods when political will falters or political attention is focused elsewhere. The purposes, methods, and benefits of urban growth boundaries have been tested and refined for decades now. There is a substantial body of statutes, rules, and analytic methods for determining land needs for initially drawing the boundaries, how to manage urban growth boundaries shared by multiple incorporated places for measuring land absorption, setting criteria, on and on and on. The drafters of the new model code will have more years and varieties of experience creating a framework for urban growth boundaries than the creators of model zoning did at the time that they enacted or adopted their model enabling legislation. Now something about transportation planning. 25 years ago, transportation planners in our region began work on a long anticipated and widely assumed completion of a beltway system. It was called the Western Bypass. And this is the existing network of roads and highways that have been built up. And then the next step, which everyone assumed was inevitable, was to build this, the Western Bypass. I wondered about how such a road comes to be proposed. And I read an article by John Pucher, who was published by American Planning Association. He's at Rutgers. And it was a very simple, very powerful article. And his point was how we travel, where we travel, how much we travel is determined not solely, but in large part, by our settlement patterns. That it's not a cultural affinity for the car, but how our communities are built that accounts for the way that Americans use cars and not other modes of transportation. So we began to speak out against the Western bypass, and I mentioned aide to Governor Goldschmidt told me that the bypass was a done deal. Now, there's nothing that motivates me, like someone telling me what the outcome is going to be. So that began about a decade of work, local organizing, appearance at the Capitol. In fact, the weather last night reminded me of a very important event in this history, which was we had decided to challenge the bypass at the outset by saying you can't build an urban facility outside an urban growth boundary. Very simple proposition. No one had tested that. And we wrote up this brief. I was pretty proud of it, but of course I waited until the last minute. And Keith Bartholomew, who helped me with the brief, and I got to work by bicycle. So all of a sudden it's 25 of midnight, and the day we have to file, we have a 30-pound box of briefs. And we go outside, and because the weather is unbelievably cold for Oregon, it was about 18, none of the cabs were running. So we sat there, and all of a sudden I remember, even though it was cold, I remember breaking out in a sweat, which was, oh my God. Even though the client is the organization, this is called malpractice, and I may have now allowed a freeway to be built. And a guy comes by in a Volkswagen van and rolls down the window and says, "You guys waiting for someone?" He said, "We're desperate for a ride." I said, "Where?" "The post office." He said, "Hop in." So we head toward the post office, and he said, "Why are you going?" And I looked at Keith and I thought, oh my God, maybe he's a big fan of freeways. So we kind of chatted, and we said, well, you know, it's a very important case, we'll set precedents, and, you know, it might end up in the Supreme Court. And he was slowing down, and we started missing the lights, you know. And I was about ready to just reach over and put my foot on the accelerator. When we got there, we raced in, and we filed the briefs at 3 minutes of midnight. We won. And that began a long challenge, but really the bulk of that challenge was not in the courts. It was in coming up with an alternative to the bypass, and it was this alternative. We said, instead of building a freeway, let's change how the communities grow on the western side of the region. Let's change the zoning. Let's require the roads to be connected. Let's build sidewalks. Let's develop around the light rail line that's coming. And we developed that alternative at the cost of $3 million. And this is a summary map of it. And Keith Bartholomew is now a professor at the University of Utah, led this effort. And ultimately, we were able to show that our alternative was more cost effective. That we could actually address congestion more effectively while reducing driving and pollution and supporting the plans we have for growth and development. So based on these lessons, we think the new model code, and by the way, we won. There is no bypass, the zoning was changed, we have new street connectivity standards. The new model code will advance the integration of land use and transportation planning in 7 different ways. First, by requiring an integrated, internally consistent regional transportation land use plan. Second, by redefining the problems that transportation investments are supposed to address, which will make it clear that transportation investments are the means, not the ends. The purpose is not to build the highway, the purpose is to achieve a particular outcome, and you apply money for transportation to achieve the outcome. Third, land use will be used as a criteria for judging various alternatives. Fourth, by including regional land use effects and identifying environmental impacts, and as a kind of mitigation measure. Fifth, by including changes to land uses as alternative solutions or parts of solutions. Sixth, in the development and use of new, you can doze for a few seconds. New integrated dynamic econometric transportation land use models to analyze problems and define solutions. What this means is you can turn a dial and say, here's a transportation investment, and out will come the change in land use patterns, because that's what happens. And you turn the other dial, we're going to change our land use patterns, and out will come a different transportation system. That's what we need. Seventh, and finally, in institutional reforms that separate transportation, land use planning, planners, and decision makers. Those are the same activity done differently. That's how they need to be understood. But that is just one modest part of the reform of transportation system and project planning that's needed. A big part of the new model code is to fix the transportation project analysis carried out under the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA. NEPA was celebrated by environmentalists when it was adopted, particularly those who were challenging freeways, because they saw it as a way of forcing the consideration of environmental impacts when making these investment decisions. That is not what happened. As NEPA was adopted and adapted and applied in the context of transportation project analysis, if anything, it has turned into a method for greenwashing new highway projects. The NEPA analyses I have observed, and some in great detail, for various highway and bridge projects have a common set of fundamental flaws. The absence of a context for the project in a real regional transportation plan. Projects are analyzed separate from, there aren't really transportation plans, that's another subject. The way the problems are defined at the outset, we start with the problem, which is this is a corridor and we have congestion. That's the wrong frame of reference. The limited geographic area chosen for analysis. An inappropriately restricted palette of alternatives. Reliance on defective transportation planning models, I've mentioned. The absence of any rigorous cost-benefit analysis. Now, normally, when someone like me says cost-benefit analysis, a certain generation shudders, because that was always the terminology used as an argument against doing anything to protect the environment. When I talk about costs and benefits, I mean all costs. Social, environmental, economic, fiscal. And I mean all benefits in the same category. The fact is, a lot of these projects are incredibly stupid. That's a technical planning term, I know. But they just don't make sense. They're not a good use of public money. And if we were to put on the green eye shades this time and think about it in that more rigorous way, I think we'd have different outcomes. And that leads to the final defect, which is the absence of any statewide or regional opportunity cost analysis. If you do this, you're not going to do that. And that's something no one talks about. These flaws are maintained over time by a small priesthood of NEPA transportation project specialists, lawyers and planners. Many of them work for consulting firms that have a direct or indirect stake in those solutions that result in the largest amount of construction. You can tell I feel passionately about this. I think the new model code can help correct these flaws and thereby lead to smarter, cheaper, and greener outcomes. Now I'm going to close this segment with another story. You know, I mentioned this aide to the governor and said the Western Bypass is a done deal. I still remember that, obviously. Well, she did a lot of things, a lot of good things. And she had been a volunteer with our organization as a volunteer attorney. And ultimately I said, would you like to join our board of directors? And she did. And then she became board president. And we continued to make noise about transportation policy. And the governor said, I'd like you to join the Transportation Commission. And then she became the chair of the Transportation Commission. And then she became the chief advocate for another project, this one. The Columbia River Crossing, which includes $2.4 billion proposed investment in new interstate freeway lanes, interchanges, freeway bridge for a 5-mile stretch of Interstate 5 between Portland, Oregon and Vancouver, Washington. The new bridge will require the demolition of existing bridge and construction of new piers on Columbia River, which is, and I quote from their own website, a migratory corridor for 16 species listed under the Endangered Species Act, including 3 endangered runs of salmon. And this is the project she's advocating. So I objected strenuously. It was in the Metro Council. And I said, you know, you were the president of our board when we got 2 national awards for the Lutrec project. But that's not been a part of the work done by your own staff in this analysis. Brushed aside. Well, you don't really understand. This is different. We really kind of did it. So as we were arguing about this, I got a phone call from her. And she said, I saw your PowerPoint, and it was about how you can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by changing urban form as an alternative. I said, yeah, well, that's great. She said, I'd like to borrow it. I said, really? Why? I said, I'm making a presentation to Al Gore. So I thought about the irony of it. And I said, what the hell? It's a small state like Vermont, but she might be an ally again. I said, you're welcome to it. So I hope Al Gore enjoyed that presentation. Move on to another story. A few years ago, I attended a presentation by a scientist who received the Nobel Prize for his work. Well, so we're saving that for dinner. No. The dean asked what happened. The president, I'm sorry, asked what happened. The same thing. I'm betting. I'd give her, well, I can't now, but I'd give her 10-to-1 odds that project will never be built. The politics are coming apart. We have a new coalition forming to go after it in Olympia, in Salem, and in Washington, D.C. And by the way, I was told it was a done deal. So I think the chief obstacle is that the project is really expensive, really badly designed. They've spent $160 million on the study. It's got a lot of political force behind it, and I think today an article came out about the chief proponent of the project, not the woman I talked about, another woman, who actually helped me with my campaign in 2004, and we've been fighting ever since. So it's the problem with small states. So I attended this presentation by this Nobel Prize laureate. He had won because he was a scientist who worked on the International Panel on Climate Change. His PowerPoint was like something from Al Gore, and it featured shrinking glaciers and pictures of fires and sea level rise, and he talked about the catastrophic consequences of climate change. So, like me, he transitioned to talking about constructive things that could be done, and that was the point of the presentation. But at the end of the talk, the climax, he showed an image of a pleasant suburban home on a small lot. And he said, this was our home, the home where he and his wife had raised their children, and he described its energy and efficiency. So actually, I started to get excited, because I thought, exactly the point, remodel, reuse. And he showed another image. He said, and this is where my wife and I live now, showing a photo of their new home, proudly describing how it functioned as a passive solar home despite the cold winter climate. The same impressive energy efficiency was achieved in his outbuilding. He said we had a workshop and parked his cars. He concluded by noting that not only was the home energy efficient, but demonstrated that such homes could be very attractive. At least at my table, there was an appalled silence. We stared at the image showing a new house clearly much bigger than 2,000 square feet for 2 people, and an outbuilding the size of my home, sitting on what appeared to be a 10 or 20 acre rural home site in a forest in the mountains at least 40 miles from any city. It was mind-boggling. A Nobel Prize winning scientist, an honorable man, dedicated to alerting the world to the perils of climate change, was so blind to the larger issue of the massive consumption of materials which generate climate-changing gas, and the enormous waste of land, the destruction of habitat, the paving of roads, and the substantial amount of driving associated with building new rural homes on acreage home sites. Rural residential sprawl, that is building on 10, 20, 40, 60, or in the West, 160 acre home sites, is having a massive impact on the resource lands of America, and now in Europe and developing countries. This pattern of exurban rural sprawl dwarfs suburban sprawl. We have to find a way to stop this. Many states, notably Vermont, but also Florida, Maryland, New Jersey, Colorado, have tried to protect rural lands by buying conservation easements, buying development rights, or just buying the land outright. After 20 years of both public and private investment in conservation easements and acquisitions, Vermont's protected about 430,000 acres of farm and forest lands and natural areas. That's about a fifth of the state. I'm pretty confident this makes Vermont by far the leader in all 50 states in the proportion of rural lands that have been conserved through easements and acquisition programs. More applause. See him. But in most states, public funds and tax credits will never be able to protect more than a modest percentage of rural resource lands. For example, after spending $2.5 billion, $300 million a year, Florida has protected about 2% of the state's rural area. At the rate of $300 million a year, it will take a century to protect 1/4 of Florida's remaining rural lands. A lower cost and effective way to protect rural resource lands is through zoning, simply prohibiting rural residential development. This has been done in many scattered locations around the country, like Pennsylvania, South Dakota, Virginia, parts of Washington, parts of California, and statewide in Oregon. In Oregon, about 94% of all private lands are in a farm zone or a forest zone, 94%. That's about 40,000 square miles, an area about the size of Maine and Connecticut combined. In the 11 years beginning in 1997 and ending in 2007, about 1,000 new homes were approved on those 40,000 square miles. It's about 5% of the total. Does that seem like a good performance or a bad performance? My answer is yes. Compared to almost all states, it's very good, but compared to what we should be doing, it's not quite good enough. Zoning to protect farm, forest, and rangelands is very difficult politically. Since 1973, we've had 5 challenges of the ballot box to our planning program, and that's been the primary focus. A remedy that is politically realistic, financially affordable, and effective has to be found, and I think we can find one by drawing on the combination of the best practices from states like Vermont, New Jersey, Maryland, New York, Kentucky, and Oregon, supplemented with a few more bells and whistles. This is not going to be easy. It's not going to be cheap, and it's not going to be without controversy, but I think it is feasible. Here's what the elements should be in the new model code. First, a conservation plan for the entire state, all the important resource lands or a large area. You cannot do conservation in a buckshot approach. It doesn't work. The plan must identify specific, measurable conservation goals or outcomes tailored to the purpose. By the way, in Norman Williams' treatise, when I looked at forest zoning, it said, look under open space districts. It's completely different things. Forest zoning is for production, whether it's water, wildlife, or wood. It's not for aesthetic purposes. It's actually a form of industrial zoning. So if that's what you want to do, then you need one thing. If you're trying to protect groundwater and surface water, you need something else. If you want farmland protection is not aesthetic regulation, it's something different. You set those goals and objectives, and you have to tie the objectives to deadlines, which a number of places have done. By this date, we'll have accomplished this. By this date, we'll have accomplished the next. A new agency has to be given the mission to carry this out, preferably with willing participation of local governments, but able to act, and the local governments won't. Certainly was the case in Oregon. Funding is necessary to administer the program and various incentives, and one source of it is an assessment on government-created windfalls. When land is upzoned, when infrastructure is put in, land values go up. We know that. Slice a little bit of that off. Use that to pay for conservation. And then the hard part, existing rural residential development entitlements must be quantified, capped, and assigned as rights to landowners and given expiration dates. If you don't use it, you lose it. Rural cluster zoning would become mandatory, exercised according to a set of state criteria or maps, designed to protect the most valuable lands and to organize development in ways that make sense for the provision of infrastructure and services. The open space left after clustering would be protected by zoning and easements. The extinction, that's not enough. After you do all that, it's still not enough. You have to extinguish a number of those development rights. And in order to do that, I think you need 2 things. You need an easement fund, and you need a transferable development right program. Now, TDRs have been seen as a salvation by a lot of free market oriented people. They've only worked well in one state, New Jersey, but they have worked there. They need to have an administering agency, a bank, and you actually need to have landing zones. That's where you're going to take the development rights where people really want to develop, which actually I think means you're going to sacrifice something. The place that, one of the places you want to protect, you're going to give away to draw off that development. State infrastructure investments, operations, and maintenance should be revised to reflect and support the rural conservation and also enhance the desirability of the landing zones. And finally, an area that's not much explored, local systems development charges, permit fees, property taxes, and local services have to be reformed to support the program. So in California, in some areas now, you build in a forest zone that's high fire risk, that's fine, no protection. Actually, and if you don't build it right, they'll spray a spot on the road leading into your house, which means if there's a fire, the trucks go by, right? They're not going to protect it. So what would happen to financing for homes if they said there is going to be no fire protection, certainly no infrastructure, we're not sure about the roads will remain gravel, and police protection will give you a 30-minute response time or a 50-minute response time. I think it would have a salutary effect on where people choose to live. This approach has a lot of moving parts, and complexity can make implementation more challenging, but I think it borrows the best from the best, and it might work. From substance, I'm going to switch quickly to process and wrap up. There's a lot of prizes awarded for plans, the content of plans, and no prizes, almost no prizes, for implementation of plans. And In fact, the only prize for implementation of a plan I ever saw was for the implementation of a highway construction plan. This is completely wrong. A good plan not implemented is a waste of time and money and a fraud of the public. What we want are plans that work, and the focus in planning schools and law schools should be on how do you get to implementation. That's a huge subject in itself. I'm teaching a class on plan implementation now. I'm going to talk about just two ideas that I think could be borrowed in other places. The first is a specialized land use court we have in Oregon called the Land Use Board of Appeals. In Oregon, one of the things that happened was we said governments are going to be the ones who make the determination of whether a proposal, that the facts of the proposal meet the requirements of the law. So they will have to act like judges. Although one of my law professors, when we were talking about quasi-judicial decision-making, he said, you know what quasi means, don't you? Not. Anyway, that it's really up to local officials who have the responsibility to look at the facts and determine whether or not they meet the requirements of their plan. And so what happened is, now, no one has trials over land use matters. If you challenge a local decision, you go to the Land Use Board of Appeals for virtually all local government decisions. Now, the Land Use Board of Appeals was something that was very attractive to developers. Why? Because they said a couple things that they're going to get out of it. One, we're not going to be in the trial courts, which have huge dockets, and we're not going to have trials. It's going to be an appellate proceeding. So that's faster, that's cheaper, and we're going to insist on deadlines. 3 weeks after the final decision, you have to file your appeal. 3 weeks after that, your briefs are due. It's incredibly fast. And then LUB itself has a deadline for taking action, and they can only extend that if they get permission from the parties. In addition, the developer said, we want some consistency. We don't have state laws interpreted by circuit courts in 36 counties. We want a clear, defensible result. And finally, they said more recently, and we want to keep out people who file frivolous appeals. So LUBA has to award attorney fees whenever a frivolous appeal is filed. Guess what? Groups like Thousand Friends of Oregon and other groups said, sounds good. That's what we want too. We want the same thing. We want the consistency, we want the clarity, we want the speed. And it turns out that LUBA is a very friendly venue for citizens bringing their own appeals. Because although it's specialized, it's pretty informal, the rules are very clear, and what has happened is that citizens have done a lot of monitoring. They're the ones who actually challenge a lot of the cases, much more than the Attorney General's office ever does. And primarily the citizens are challenging questionable decisions on the development of farm and forest land, and their track record is pretty high. So what we got was enforcement. And for those citizens, they didn't have to hire a lawyer. I know it's disappointing to the students here, but for most people, to have to hire a lawyer is an economic crisis in your family. The other thing that happened that was part of this reform was all that nonsense about standing, who has the right to challenge something, swept away. If you're bored and you come to a hearing in Oregon one night, you know, TV is no good, it's a rerun of Downton Abbey, and you say, well, I'm going to drop down at the Planning Commission, and you stand up and say, I don't think that's right. I think that, you know, based on what I've seen in the last 5 minutes, looking at my iPhone, I think that that violates this section of your land use regulations. You have the right to appeal. Nothing else. Now, what we're taught in law school was there would be a flood of litigation, as though everyone has time and money to hire lawyers for recreational litigation. I mean, it's kind of a preposterous idea. In fact, the number of cases have been about 300 a year, which is a fraction of what the appellate court has. And it really has been opened up the system to allow people to challenge decisions because the legislature said everyone has a stake in the outcome of these decisions because that's how we implement our plan. I'm going to close by talking a little bit about the evolution of our thought. It's not something to include in a model code. The Scientific American article about Dennis Meadows notes that, quote, he no longer spends time trying to persuade humanity of the limits to growth. Instead, he says, I'm trying to understand how communities and cities can buffer themselves against the inevitable hard landing. I had lunch with Paul Gilding, who wrote The Great Disruption, and he considers himself now an optimist in the context of collapse of civilization because he thinks we'll get through it. By the end of the century, we'll only lose about a quarter of the population, which is equal to everyone living in North and South America, Europe, Russia, Australia. This was such a disturbing presentation, even though he did it with great cheer and optimism. We started talking about what we should be doing personally to prepare for things, or whether we'd feel guilty thinking about ourselves and not the wider world. And I made a remark about, well, maybe we should skip buying solar panels, just buy guns. And Paul looked at me very seriously and said, if we have to buy guns, we failed. Strong social bonds are what will allow us to survive and make it through a difficult time. I've thought about that remark a lot since then. And the kind of communities we need to be developing have to have at their heart this idea of social bonds. Less space for private consumption, more places for social interaction support, whether they're cafes or parks or playgrounds, more group living, less McMansions, more villages, and a lot less acreage home sites. We need to challenge the absurd artificial world of the neoliberals in which sprawl is the manifestation of the free market and freedom. What a ridiculous proposition that is. Sprawl is created by a set of rules, of laws, of incentives, of handbooks, of banking practices. It's something we have created and we can change it. And we have to challenge neoliberals' assumptions about our economy. The pollution of land, air, and water and destruction of ecosystems are not just externalities, market imperfections, but infringements on the enjoyment of our own property, our own ability to live and thrive. Maybe that should not be part of anyone's property rights. The intellectual rethinking of property rights, responsibilities, and their connection to freedom must go hand in hand with practical steps of designing and implementing new model codes for the use and conservation of land and resources. Perhaps the most important part of this entire effort will not be the particulars of a particular code or a law review article about property rights, but the forward thinking and community conversations that we have together as we prepare for a difficult journey from the civilization today to a sustainable civilization tomorrow. Our greatest danger will come, and many people made this observation, when the cumulative stress on our natural systems and related social and economic problems, such as rising food prices, begins to shake public confidence in our institutions. Now, this can happen very fast. It happened in the end of the Soviet Union. Rome was very unusual in civilization that had a long decline. Better to go through that than what happened in many places. At that moment of crisis, when people begin to doubt the future, there must be a reservoir of thought and people with constructive ideas about how to meet the crisis. They'll provide hope by offering alternatives to ideological extremes, nationalism, demagoguery, and all different shades of conspiracy that lead us down to a path of war and destruction. Will we succeed in rising to the challenge of creating a sustainable civilization? I don't know. But if we do, it will be thanks to people like you. Thank you. I thought if I dragged it out a little bit, I could avoid questions, but apparently I failed. Are there questions? Yes?
I was wondering if you could address, when you talked about transportation systems, you focused on urban areas primarily, or Portland specifically. Could you...
Thank you, Pete. Could you talk about your thoughts on sustainable transportation systems in a place like Vermont, which is primarily rural?
Good question. I think one of the first things I think about is being very, collecting enough information to know how, when, and why people travel, because again, changing land use patterns might eliminate a lot of the car trips. That's the first thing. Second thing is that there have been some successes with initiatives to fund rural transit systems in pretty conservative places. I think Wyoming was one of them. I think overall the challenge is harder in a place that has dispersed population. I mean, it's more difficult, but you know, it might be cheaper to subsidize a corner store than to widen a road, and that really is something to think about. There may be some technological things that can be done to reduce trips as well. I think we can't be too far away from the point at which you type in, I'm going to go from here to there now. Is anyone willing to take me? We can have a kind of pass system, and maybe you can do a lot more carpooling. And then for the rest of it, I am going to wait to hear what you people in Vermont come up with so we can apply it elsewhere. Yes, sir.
I'm really intrigued by your...
I'm intrigued by your microphone.
Yeah, me too, thank you. Your comments on growth boundaries, 'cause I've been trying to initiate a conversation about growth boundaries in upstate New York for quite some time. I'm on the board of the Upstate Planning Association, and I can't get any traction. It seems that the impediments of home rule and this de Tocqueville concept of independence that exists in New England and the Northeast is a real impediment to regionalism and self-reliance. And I'm trying to figure out how we overcome that challenge in a way that isn't dominating and paternalistic, but in an empowering, community-based way.
Well, it's a question that's often asked, and it's clear from what you heard a little bit about Oregon is we made a clear choice, which we were more interested in the reality of a certain landscape than a theory about local democracy. We don't have town meetings, most places. I think the value of having government close to you and seeming more democratic is genuine and real. The fact is, the farther down the ballot you go, the lower the percentage of people vote. So people talk about, I really want to have control by my local officials, and if you ask them who are they don't know. So what they're saying is, I want to have control by the people I didn't vote for, and I don't know who they are. Right? So what I think is the best thing is to try and set up choices where people can pick which of these is more important. Now we've had to do that kind of in odd ways, but I end up talking about this idea with people in Maryland where there could be a ballot measure. And the ballot measure says, this is the outcome we want for our state. Not what Washington State did where you have the whole law, because then it's just picked apart. But you say, these are the outcomes you want. That's approved, let's say by a big margin. If you've done your homework and you know your community. Then the next stage is, well, everyone's agreed we're going to get there, and we're going to figure out how to get there because we have to get there. And then at that point it becomes a choice. Well, if we can do it through local governments, that's best. But if we can't, then we'll have to do it another way. So especially in the rural lands issue, the fact is it's just been terribly difficult. And my personal view of observation of politics is that what happens is if you're consistent enough over time, then it becomes accepted. But every time you falter and make compromises, you reawaken this desire to allow anyone to build anything, anywhere, anytime. So it's a difficult transition. What I've seen generally in the United States, and it's not universal, but is because of who pays for local elections and the power it gives, local officials alone will not succeed in an agenda of urban containment and stopping rural sprawl. And so there's a hard choice to be made. Any women like to ask a question? Okay, we'll stick with white guys, okay.
I'll talk on behalf of those that aren't like me then. You were talking about your friend who had, the quote was hard landing, and the world losing 25% of its population. I'm from Detroit, which has a lot of, or has a big population vacuum right now. 25 to 30% of the city is vacant. So I'm wondering if you've ever run across or contemplated structured depopulation of cities and how we might go about that as the U.S.'s demographics change over time.
Well, as I recall the numbers, even though Detroit City has hollowed out, the region has actually still been growing. So what we have is...
Maybe past its boundaries, however.
Yeah. I mean, this happened in upstate New York where the cities fell in population, the developed area expanded as the population fell. Actually see this in Italy, and it's actually related phenomena. People stopped having kids, they started having second homes. It's not the same as Detroit, but I mean, there is an affluenza spreading around the world. UN talks about how we're using more and more land for the population. My goal is to have cities thriving, vital, and repopulated. That's really what I think is more sustainable for a variety of reasons. I know that a number of places like Cleveland, I have friends in Cleveland, have to think about the advantages they have for the city of Cleveland, not the region, but the city. They're going to do some environmental restoration of lands that are vacated. I know some of that's discussed in Detroit, but I think as a basic strategy, the strategy is going to be to make the city strong and healthy and grow again and not disperse over the landscape. Other questions?
Why don't we let people drink?
Drink? I thought you said think, John. Thank you very much.